Crisis or challenge? Crisis or challenge? What's the difference? Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to discuss that here in a second. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, give me some comments. If you don't like what I have to say, please hit dislike. Tell me why in the comments. And go ahead and continue to hate watch because you still help my algorithms that way. All right, just joking. If you don't like what I have to say, tell me why. We'll have a civil discussion about it and we'll figure out where it's going to go. This evening, I want to talk to you about what's going on at the border and whether or not it's a crisis or a challenge, because I'm not sure what defines what. I think there's somewhere around a 50,000. The number is somewhere around 50,000 to decide what's a challenge and what is a crisis, but we'll go from there. We're also going to touch on gun control, not a whole lot, just some comparisons I want to make with what's been brought up because I haven't seen anything in black and white yet. I've just heard some sound bites and seen some interviews, but I want to throw some numbers out there for you to stop and think about. And then we're going to talk about the Chauvin trial in Minneapolis because what you're seeing in the news and actually listening to the testimony are two far different things. And part of the problem with that, I think, is going to become at the end of the trial expectation management for people because it's a tragedy no matter how you look at it. And there are no winners in this. But with that, let's go ahead and get started talking about the border. Okay, so we talked about the border, and I really don't want to compare figures from last March and April because we're in the middle of COVID. And there's a lot of other things going on that did affect the number of migrants coming to the border. But where we're at now, between last month and this month, there was an increase of 71%, which seems like an awful lot to me. I'm no math expert, but I did pass statistics with an A. So U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered more than 172,000 people trying to enter the U.S. along the southern border in March, up from 100,441 in February. And this is according to the administration's analysts of the numbers. And this is from USA Today, so I'm definitely not going to an alt-right source because I didn't want to do that. Now, the number I also find interesting is 18,890 unaccompanied children from Central America. That's twice the number in February. Now, that's important to me because you know how I feel about human trafficking, and these often become the victims of it. So I'm not trying to point a finger. What I am saying is, and I'll use the military as an example. If you take over a unit, if you're the commander or if you're the command enlisted leader of that unit, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, once you take it over, it's yours. So President Biden, you wanted to be president. Vice President Harris, you want to be vice president. Vice President Harris should be on the border trying to figure out what's going on because it was handed off to her. I saw news flashes. I was sitting down that the administration's border czar has resigned, which good for them. That's probably a good thing because maybe we'll get something done now. Now, I'm not placing blame on Joe Biden for this happening. Maybe he said something that was taken the wrong way. I don't know for sure. What I am saying is it's your problem now, so let's fix it. You can only blame the last administration for so long before you take blame or credit for what's going on. And right now, for you, that's taking blame because you're not doing anything to fix it. Now, the Second Amendment debate. And I will tell you, as somebody who is a fan of the Second Amendment, I own guns. I do believe in responsible firearm ownership. I do think there are some guns that do not belong in people's hands. And that's as far as I'm going to go with that. The comments he's made so far are discussing what's called ghost guns, which Google it. I'm only going so far into this based on YouTube algorithms and what they can do as far as limiting the distribution of my videos and showing other people that are out there. So I'm being very careful, especially in this section of the video. And he also talked about pistol braces, which the way they describe pistol braces are not exactly accurate. What I would tell you to do is Google what pistol braces are and what they're used for. And he also talked about guns being used in self-harm. And what I will say with that is it goes back to another one of my arguments of if somebody's going to self-harm, they're going to self-harm. Whether they have a firearm or not, they're still going to do it. So how about we actually look at the mental health aspect of what's leading them to self-harm? which is something nobody wants to talk about because it's expensive, because it's time consuming, because it's hard. It's much easier to throw a bunch of sound bites out there about gun control and pistol braces and ghost guns. But here's my issue with the whole thing. The true victims of crime, because a couple of the different clips I watched, and because they were ABC News, I didn't want to get involved with copyright and trying to argue fair use. What I will tell you is if you go on YouTube and look up Joe Biden gun control, there's some ABC News clips where he brings up certain numbers. He talks about the doctor, his wife, and her 3 children who were killed in South Carolina. So that's 5 dead. They talked about shootings in Colorado and somewhere else, which equaled out to 18 dead, which I get. And mass shootings are a tragedy. But here's the part that nobody's talking about, that what this gun control is going to do nothing to stop. This past weekend, and I just pulled up the first thing I found, and it's Chicago. This past weekend in Chicago, 36 shot, 4 fatally. Now, ghost guns and pistol braces have nothing to do with this. That's 36 people shot compared to 23 in the 2 examples they gave in the mass shootings. And I do feel for them, and it is a tragedy. But the other part of this is, let me find the other part, which I found interesting. The weekend was just as deadly and saw more people shot than a week ago when 20 people were shot in weekend gun violence. So over a 2-week period, that's 56 people shot in Chicago. That's more people shot than we had in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria combined in the last 2 weeks, in the last year. So you tell me, what is gun control actually going to accomplish with what they're trying to do? It's not going to stem this tide by any means. So instead of addressing where the actual problem lies, we're gonna have knee-jerk reactions that sound good to the press and sound good to your constituents, but we're not actually going to protect the citizens of the United States. So I call nay on that one. It's kind of like the whole, what does the $1.9 trillion where the jury finds that your gun control methods are crap and they're not actually going to solve any of the true problems that are out there. They may solve onesies and twosies, but the mass shootings that are going on due to gangland and crime in places like Chicago and New York City, your gun control is going to do nothing there because they already have some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. So moving along to the Chauvin trial. And what I find interesting about the Chauvin trial is if you read the press and what's going on, and this is CNN, MSNBC, the Washington Post, ABC, they're not lying in the stories that they're putting out there. But they're also being disingenuous from the fact of they're talking about what the prosecutor said because the medical examiner said this, or the use of force expert from the Minneapolis Police Department said this. And what they're leaving out is the answers that were given when the defense did the cross. And I have watched quite a few hours of the testimony, and I'm not going to go to those because, like I said, I don't want to get involved in fair use and copyright disputes, but I've linked them in the description so you can go back and look at it yourself. It's kind of like the going through actual legislation. Most people don't have the time or patience for it. I actually like doing it. And it's the same thing with court. I like listening to the testimony because there's little things said here and there. And what I'm going to focus on is a medical examiner and the Minneapolis Police Department's use of force expert. And I'm going to go through the medical examiner first because that part's a little bit shorter. And the use of force expert, the fact that I was a defensive tactics instructor for the state of Missouri in corrections, I can kind of speak to some of what he's saying with a little more depth than I can with the medical examiner. I just found some of the stuff the medical examiner said very interesting. So to start with the medical examiner, it was Dr. Baker. And on redirect, he talked about the things when he was being questioned by the prosecution about what could have led to the death and what he found. But on redirect, he also started talking about some other things, which is additional causations that could lead to death. In the case of George Floyd, I'm going to glance down at my notes to make sure I get this right, because I probably spent 12 hours watching testimony over the last week. So bear with me as we go through this, but there's some interesting facts that came up on redirect. And I'm going to bring up at the end why they're important. And let me just caveat this by saying I'm not an attorney. I do have a little over a year of law school, but I am by no means a bar certified attorney in any state. I'm just going to give you the common person's opinion based on what I'm hearing, because that's what the jury is. Now, contributing factors to the death of George Floyd: enlarged or a dilated heart with narrowed arteries, a history of hypertension, a history of drug use, and these are all contributing factors to his death. So, one, the prosecution has to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt that Chauvin actually planned this. And right now he's charged with second degree murder, third degree murder, or manslaughter. And the biggest difference is, with my understanding, once again, try to give you a common sense definition of this instead of just reading it off a slide, is for second degree murder, you caused the death of someone, but you did not go into it with the intent to do that. For third degree murder, you injure someone that leads to their death. And with manslaughter, it can fall under negligence, which goes back to some comments that I'll come back to again about whether or not he said, I swallowed a whole bunch of drugs, because there's also an argument with the defense saying they heard this in a recording and the prosecution saying they didn't. Well, I think it's a mistake from the prosecutor, because if the prosecutor heard, or if the officer heard, I swallowed too many drugs, then you have a requirement to get him medical care as fast as possible, because people do swallow drugs so they don't get caught with them. And once those have been ingested, that can lead to an overdose and death. So that could have been grounds to find negligence in a manslaughter conviction. But the prosecution said they didn't hear it, so it doesn't exist. Now, the other thing brought up by the medical examiner was during the autopsy, there was no proof of bruising on the back or the neck, which shows the amount of weight displayed in the video. And I'll get more into video and how it can be deceptive when we start talking about the actual use of force. But he said there was no sign of bruising from that on George Floyd. And he did a special dissection. I would advise you, if you're interested in this and seeing how he came up with his conclusions, to watch his testimony, because it actually is pretty interesting if you have any desire to learn about this stuff at all. Another medical expert on cross said, had she not seen the video, had she just walked into a home and found George Floyd passed out on the ground based on the amount of methamphetamine and fentanyl in his system, she would have considered it a drug overdose. Because remember, fentanyl depresses your respiratory system. It slows down your breathing. It causes less oxygen to enter the body. So are all these contributing factors what led to his death, or was it purely the alleged knee on the neck? And I say alleged because there's another angle of the video that shows the knee on the shoulder as opposed to the neck. Now, that's as far as I'm going to go with the medical examiners. Like I said, I've linked it in the description. Please go back and look at it if you have any interest in it at all. It really was pretty interesting. If you have any desire to learn about this stuff or an interest in it, the Minneapolis Police Department use of force expert, which is Lieutenant Marcel, who also, he's testified that approximately 10 years ago, they changed their program and went to what they call ground tactics control. And what this was the use of body weight tactics and locks as opposed to strikes and blows, which, as a defensive tactics instructor in Missouri, we really don't train with the use of body weight, because you don't want to rely on that. You'd rather rely on technique and locks and pressure points than trying to use your body weight. But we also do not train blows and strikes, because many times they're not effective, and it's an experience thing. And if you're not a trained fighter, then they're not that effective. So I understand going to locks, and the body weight I'm still kind of torn on. But what you see with this is one of the techniques he uses. And Lieutenant Marcel, at one point when the prosecutor's asking him, said, yes, what he saw in the video was a display of excessive force. Now, later on redirect, he states he's used the same technique before. And what I will say is that's probably a very honest answer, because when it comes to use of force, be it inside a prison or with a police officer with a suspect, it is a very dynamic situation. And they have in Missouri, we call it a use of force continuum. Minneapolis has something very similar that says, if your suspect does this, then here's the options you have. And in Missouri, it's drawn up as a wheel. And the reason it's done that way is that use of force continuum is not cement. It's not black and white. It's a very dynamic chart based on here's their actions, here's what you can do, from verbal all the way up to the use of deadly force. But there's a huge issue when it comes to uses of force, because the big C in any use of force, the biggest C, and this is whether you're going hands-on or you're dealing with an emotionally disturbed person, is control. Control the situation, control a suspect, but most of all, control yourself. Control your emotions, control what's going on around you. And in this case, if you listen to what Lieutenant Marcel says, I apologize. That upper respiratory thing's still clearing up. So, but he says, he's asked, is there a point where you would maintain a restraint in this way until the situation is stabilized? And he answers, yes, until it is code 4, which means the situation is stable. Well, at the same time, you have 2 rookie officers, 1 experienced officer. And when that experienced officer shows up, regardless of rank, then they have to take control of that scene because they have the experience. Now, when he showed up, he knew George Floyd. They've proved that they actually did know each other in the past. And George Floyd is heard on camera saying, "Take me out of the car." Now, his actions when Chauvin showed up on scene, 2 different use of force experts said at that moment he would have been authorized to use a taser, and he chose not to, which means he chose a lesser degree of force. With pulling him out of the car and putting him on the ground, which is what George Floyd requested, I would surmise and I would throw out there that maybe based on the prior knowledge of George Floyd, that Chauvin may have been trying to de-escalate the situation. Now, by the same token, with attempting to de-escalate with George Floyd, you had a crowd of 13 to 15 people, and this was testified to by a member of the crowd who was also a member of the Minneapolis Fire Department, who was EMT qualified, who she herself admitted to screaming vulgarities at the officers as they're trying to do their job. Now, I would say that scene was not code 4, based not just on George Floyd, but the 13 to 15 people screaming vulgarities and yelling and all the noise and everything else going on. So what is left for those officers to do? They've got to figure out the situation. Eventually, George Floyd was placed into an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. It's a tragedy. I won't say it's not. This is a situation in which there's no winners. There's not going to be any winners here. What I would say is some of the stuff that's been brought up, I think, can lead to some doubts in the mind of jurors. What's disingenuous from the press is the only thing they're talking about is the prosecution's successes with getting these questions answered. So when the time comes and if there is an acquittal, then the general population, because they haven't followed the trial closely other than mainstream press, is not going to be prepared for that outcome, which will lead to the same things that happened when it initially happened with rioting and looting and burning. In all honesty, I think there's a 90% chance that's going to happen either way, regardless of if he's convicted or acquitted. And I don't know where it's going to go. Like I said, I'm not an attorney. What I see as a common person is there's room for doubt based on some things that have been brought up between the use of force instructors, the medical examiners, and the totality of the evidence I've seen. I could be wrong. But the links to those interviews or the links to the actual testimony is in the description. Please check it out. It's very interesting. With that, hopefully Wednesday I'll have an interview with a former gubernatorial candidate. If you like what I have to say, like, subscribe. Please let me know in the comments, share with your friends. If you dislike what I have to say, then please hit dislike and tell me why in the comments. Other than that, everybody have a good evening and take care of your families.